Hi, I'm Jeremy Ruston, and welcome to TiddlyWiki Hangout number 46. Today is a very select gathering. I'm joined by Nathen. Nathen, would you like to say hi and where you're from and your involvement with TiddlyWiki?
Hi, I'm Nathan Kane. I'm a developer from Ohio in the United States, and I've been following and working with the TiddlyWiki 5 code base uh, for a while now, 6 to 8 months or so.
Indeed, indeed. And one of the... Oh, great. Here's Eric as well. Eric, hiya. How are you?
Good morning.
Good morning, Eric. Good to see you. Glad you could make it today. We've glad that's great. Well, what we were going to do today was we're just 5.0.11. I'm hoping to release on Thursday or Friday of this week. So there's a handful of new features since the previous Hangout 2 weeks ago. So I was going to gloss through some of those, but paying particular attention to an outstanding question, which is about the most appropriate defaults. So let me share my screen, and hopefully you can see my screen. And now I'm just bringing up a local version of tiddlywiki.com. And in fact, you can immediately see a change, which is that even though the URL of the bookmark that I selected is just that, during boot up, TiddlyWiki has extended the URL with a colon, and then you can see there the list of default tiddlers. And as I click on links, you can also see that before the colon, it inserts the current tiddler. So this is TiddlyWiki Classics permalink and permaview idea, but the two things baked into one. If I take that URL, okay, just with a single tiddler title on it, then it opens the default tiddlers and then selects or navigates to the nominated tiddler. And if I try and do that with a URL of a tiddler that isn't in the default tiddlers, like tiddler fields, it gets opened and added to the top of the default tiddlers and displayed. And if I click on a few more tiddlers, yeah, you can see how it all piles up. Now, at the moment, I've got it set up so that all of those adjustments to the bit of the URL after the hash do not affect the history. But the behavior is configurable in a couple of ways, in which is configurable via a new settings tab in advanced settings. So I'm not completely thrilled with this layout, but anyway, the two options are: first, every time you navigate, whether the title bar doesn't get updated at all, the address bar, I'm sorry, whether it gets updated just with a link to the current target tiddler, or if it gets updated with a link to the target tiddler and the full story sequence. And so if we put that on no, and then clear this URL, then it wants me to, sorry, clear it to that. And now as I click on links and indeed open new tiddlers, it does not, it doesn't update the address bar. And the other setting is whether or not history gets updated when you when we navigate. So if we set that to yes, the default is no, and we'll have the full permaview updating. Now, as I click on links a few times, if I then drop down the browser history, you can see it's filled up the browser history, and as I go back, it jumps around between tiddlers, and you can see, if necessary, it closes tiddlers as it goes back in history, and that's because obviously this URL includes the record of which tiddlers are opened. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, I like that.
So the big question is what we should have as the default. Because it's, to me, it seems like I actually don't. I think the updating the history is mostly wrong. I think for casual users, they come to TiddlyWiki.com, they click around on a few things, they would expect back to take them to the previous website. So that, yeah, I'm saying that as my kind of initial position. So that seems reasonable to have that as a default of no. Here, the permaview setting is, I think, the most useful because it's a nice sort of very explicit feature. If you see those URLs changing, then it's kind of reasonably clear what's going on, and compared to Google Groups where you have to select a specific drop down to retrieve a URL. That seems not bad. Modulo, of course, browser is not showing you the current URL. But equally, is it going to confuse people if they come to TiddlyWiki.com and browse around the place and suddenly the URL grows into something big and complicated looking?
Well, I think that another important aspect of this might be just the ability to share links and the expectation there. If I copy a URL out of my URL bar and IM it to someone, and they click that link, I kind of expect them to end up where I was in a sense.
Yes. Yeah, see, I
That
must
being
say,
the case, I think that also kind of ties into the question of the history. I don't necessarily expect to have that included in that context.
Hmm.
So, I would think that would sort of be how I would expect the default configuration to behave.
Okay, which would be this permaview setting. But the thing that's very interesting that you made me think while you were saying that is if one was on a browser that hid the address bar, then actually there's no question in my mind that this would be the right setting, because the only downside of this setting is the accumulation of complicated looking gobbledygook at the end of the URL. So that seems like it's not a bad rule of thumb, actually, because it suggests that, I mean, we know that even when URLs are displayed, people tend to ignore them, and there are so many poor quality URLs out there that people have long ago generally given up, I think, on
Right.
reading URLs.
Even when they share them, they kind of ignore them and share them as either just sort of these opaque blobs or with tiny URL and whatnot as explicitly opaque blobs.
Mm. Yes, yes, yes. Cool. Whilst I was showing you that, I noticed that there's some kind of hideous bug that's just been introduced to drop-down handling. But I'll try and remember to fix that afterwards. But I don't know. Let's hope it doesn't. Oh yes, there's quite a. There's a problem that's might well get in the way of a few things. Okay, so in fact, that is the default that's currently set, and we'll go with that for 5.011 based on this discussion. The couple of very minor things. Something I've been meaning to do for ages, and it was prompted by a discussion on the group, was make vertical tabs be properly reusable. If you'd tried to reuse the vertical tabs in 5.010, there's this quite weird thing about the wrapping that basically if you tried to use the vertical tabs here, you'd end up with the content overflowing the tiddler. After a lot of research, it seems that the best way to do vertical tabs, that what I wanted was the tabs to be the minimum width necessary to contain the text up to a maximum, at which point I would like the text to wrap, and then for the tab content to expand, fill the remaining area. And it turns out, as far as I can tell, that the best way to do that is with Flexbox. And I think maybe we might have talked about Flexbox before here. It's I still think of it as being, yeah, here we go, display flexbox, as being new and unreliable. But can I use shows us that flexbox is actually quite widely supported. It suggests here that you need the prefix, but in fact I found, oh sorry, for Safari, but in fact I found that you don't need prefixes for Safari. Anyway, so very happy with that, but it is another nail in the coffin of backwards compatibility with, I don't know, IE9 and I think IE10 in practice, because I think it has a different syntax, which I don't think I am supporting at the moment. Anyway, there's a bit more of that we have to do to make pop-ups and drop-downs and sliders and so on be a bit easier to reuse. Something for, well, particularly, I think Stefan asked about this, was new, oh dear, I've just seen another typo. A before filter operator and an after filter operator. So the problem here is many people had discovered that the previous and next filter operators didn't do what they expected. That they, previous and next, take the current tiddler or the current list of tiddlers, look them up in a named list, and then return the next or previous entries. So it requires that the list that you're navigating be in a list field. And of course, very often that's not the case. So the new before and after operators instead work on the current list and then select the tiddler before or after, respectively, the one named in the operand. So it means to do an indirect thing, to select the tiddler after the current tiddler in a list, you do that, which is the standard filter syntax for indirection through a tiddler, for transclusion, I should say. So hopefully that makes it easier for one of the perennial use cases of next and previous buttons to be done. There was a really weird thing. I've switched over to using Atom, noticing lots of little wrinkles where I don't think it's quite as polished as Sublime Text. And here's a great example of that. If I type the word Jeremy and I then press, well, being on a Mac, Command Z, but Control Z to undo, I would expect any editor to worth its salt to remove the entire word, but in fact, it does it letter by letter. It feels really wrong, and I think Sublime Text is smarter than that. It coalesces runs of characters and undoes them all in one go. But one of the weird things about it is that it won't let you save a file without a new line on the end. So this is a configuration tiddler for the permaview setting. And similar tiddlers in the past, I've saved like this with no new line on the end. But you can see as soon, well, maybe you can't, there's no new line. I'm just about to press Apple S to save, and immediately it gets a new line at the end. And the problem with that is that the reveal widget, when it tries to match the text of this tiddler, it includes that new line at the end of it, which is obviously a nuisance. So the minor change I've made is to make it possible to do that, where you define in a TID file the text via an explicit text line, and that allows you then to have text in there that doesn't have a new line at the end of it. So I must update some of the other configuration tiddlers that are defined in the same way. But it's one of those, kind of crusty, annoying little problem. Quite nice to be able to just switch on something that was already there to fix it. One couple of bugs to do with dragging and dropping and external links. So this has been on the cards for ages. The here we go, linking with Wikitext. Those examples, so Nathan already made the point that should be a real Bitcoin account, which I don't have a Bitcoin account, but if anybody wants to run a Bitcoin account for me, I'd set up the URL very happily. Um, and one big change is to do with startup. So all that new handling of the um, browser address bar and history handling and so on involved adding new stuff to a file that was called startup.js. And startup.js was getting huge. So what I've now done is broken much of its functionality out. So this is now what we're left with. So it's 75 lines. And there's now a bunch of individual modules in the startup folder that handle specific bits of startup. So for instance, the story.js handles setting up the story list and the history list from the default tiddlers. The favicon startup module implements favicons basically by listening to a change to the favicon tiddler and setting up the, just in the normal way you do in a browser to dynamically set the favicon. So what there is as well is a mechanism to handle the dependencies between these startup modules. So down here, these are the current startup modules, and basically the startup mechanism will kick off. It'll devise an order for the startup tasks, honoring these dependencies. So typically it would run those two first, then startup, then these guys, and so on, right up to the render task. And temporarily there's some debug data showing us that. So the idea is that it should be easy for plugins to insert themselves into the startup sequence to ensure that they get run before a particular piece of the startup logic that might be relying on configuration being set up and so on. So it's the sort of thing that in TiddlyWiki Classic, Eric will be able to speak to the appalling hacks that plugin writers and end users had to use in order to get things running in the right order.
I think that sort of mechanism is going to be great for things like orchestrating server modules too.
Yeah, hopefully so. And when we're using TiddlyWiki as a library, which is an area I'm generally quite interested in at the moment, it requires also that you can suppress bits of startup. So the startup mechanism allows you to specify an array of modules that shouldn't be run. Gives us great high degree of control. The thing that does feel slightly weird is all this stuff is done in by module exports. So a startup module can give itself a name so that other modules can reference it, specify what platforms it runs on, and specifies, well, typically both before and an array of before and after modules. And we support both synchronous and asynchronous ones. But of course, it's very similar to the mechanisms that we've got a bit further up the conceptual stack when we're ordering the tiddlers that carry a particular tag, where we've got the list after and the list before field. My analysis at the moment is that it wouldn't be appropriate to reuse that mechanism because it's, I think, insufficiently rich to express these dependencies. But I don't know, it still feels like a bit of the dreaded duplication.
Do you think that that it would be better served to have those in fields?
Well, or in say to reuse the tagging mechanism. So basically, for startup modules to carry, you see, at the moment, part of the reason for this distinction is that TiddlyWiki supports modules that are not tiddlers. And we don't really exercise that at the moment, but one of the very early builds, I had all of the core modules just baking themselves in JavaScript without existing as tiddlers. and it's quite nice to be able to do that, because there are situations, I think, where keeping all the configuration and code out of the what's the word, data namespace is a helpful idea. So that's actually the problem, is just that there isn't for a given module, there isn't necessarily a tiddler that we can go and look at the tags of. But ideally, it would be a matter of tagging all of these modules startup, and then using the same mechanisms that we would use within the UI to specify the before and after dependencies. And conceivably,
Yeah, I could see a lot of advantages to doing it that way. For one thing, people would be able to tweak things like order of different modules loading without having to have to dig into code.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly that. Yeah. So the thing I mentioned where we let me just bring up the code. So I've written another demo app that in fact I only mentioned this to Nathan earlier. It runs up TiddlyWiki as a Node.js application, but under Node WebKit, and there's we look at the main JS, you can see what it's designed to demo is how we kick off the TiddlyWiki boot process, but we split it into two, where in between boot prefix and the main boot kernel, we set our configuration options. And that includes this business about disabling a specific startup module. Sorry, Nathan, that felt like an answer to your observation, or a response to your observation, but I'm not sure now that I can that I can see the connection I was getting at. Oh, it was about how unsatisfactory this is, because it's all code based.
right, it's configuration in code.
Which is okay for these guys. I mean, people writing applications incorporating TiddlyWiki, but less so for messing about with plugins, trying to get incompatible plugins to work together, I suppose, that kind of thing.
Or trying to do something new with some combination of plugins.
Yeah, exactly. And a pile of optimizations. I'm quite pleased with progress on optimizing it. Annoyingly, I should have set things up so that we can more easily compare things, but on my machine, which is a fast machine, but still serves as a baseline for optimizations that I've been doing. If I turn on the performance instrumentation, before the actually quite simple most recent optimization, the basic startup, the main refresh was 120 milliseconds, and this one optimization got it down to 34, which was pretty satisfying. So now things like, for me, switching to the recent tab, we've got a refresh time of 100 milliseconds, or sometimes less. Yeah, sometimes a lot less. So there's more to be done, but it just gives me confidence, really, that I shouldn't worry. I shouldn't make performance be the overriding concern, in the sense that I have been adding features that have kind of stretched the performance, but I think I should remain confident that we can continue to optimize and resolve performance concerns. One other thing I was just mentioning in passing, this is more for an Eric thing, really, is that the scheme we've got for permalink URLs, which I think I sort of vaguely wrote down here as well, it doesn't allow for paramifiers. Nathan, I don't know if you've come across these, but in classic TiddlyWiki, I can do something like that to open to refresh, to open a specific tiddler. But that is actually a shorthand for that, for open, and there are other paramifiers such as read only equals no. So if I visit classic.tiddlywiki.com with that paramifier, it switches into edit mode, which obviously TiddlyWiki 5 is always in edit mode. And
in addition to certain specific keyword paramifiers, there's also the ability to set any configuration option in the paramifiers as well. Simply the name of the configuration option, colon, and a value. As long as it's not one of the other recognized keywords, it'll be treated as an option value.
gosh, that may not be documented, but I do remember us making that change. Now, TiddlyWiki 5 does have safe mode, and that's done via you put #safe, so it just looks for that magic string, and obviously that means that if you tried to make a link to a tiddler called safe, it wouldn't work. But we don't otherwise plan to support any of these paramifiers, and particularly not that option one. And the reason is that I think it's a security risk that if you can compose different URLs to the same resource that cause that that resource to behave differently, and particularly to have perhaps different security implications, that's bad. So being able to
could open up a broad range of sort of social engineering attacks around the situation. Mm-hmm.
And it's annoying because they were incredibly useful in TiddlyWiki. So being able to set up, bookmarks here with essentially different commands that you could send at the same TiddlyWiki, multiple bookmarks, was really handy. And so I do think there needs to be some kind of workaround in a TiddlyFox and Tiddly desktop context. But I think it's the safest thing to do.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of comes down to the same question as code sandboxing in a sense. Perhaps one day when we have sort of a separate security context and the ability to isolate such things, we can revisit that. But yeah, it's sort of double-edged sword.
Yeah, no, I think so. And somebody. Oh no, sorry, I thought somebody else had joined. And it's sort of. It feels, well, as I say, that it requires a certain discipline on my part, because I quite value flexibility, and this is actually the third maybe thing where I've explicitly and deliberately restricted flexibility in order to promote security. The other one being around blacklisting HTML tags and disallowing inline event handlers in HTML.
Jeremy, take a look at the text chat, and I typed in a couple of examples of ways that the URL, the parameters that have been used. The first one, obviously, is just to choose a theme. So on the fly, you could choose a different theme. The second one was to actually make it very easy for people to ensure that they had their proper username.
Yes.
And the third one was even more useful because it allowed you to not only put in a permaview, but if that permaview included a tiddler that had a tab set in it, you could specify which tab was the initial tab.
Yeah. Now, I mean, each of those is annoyingly think of both types of use cases. So there's use cases where it's me and my own TiddlyWiki, and it's useful to be able to summon it in specific ways. But actually, being able to share it by stipulating a theme is quite useful. But as I say, I can't really see a way of doing that isn't a generic mechanism for overriding the values of tiddlers, and that seems like the thing that would be really bad.
And even something like username, I could hand you a link and suddenly you're signing edits as someone else, and
Yes, yes, yes. And
Great.
that's another actually complication is in when we use TiddlyWiki as the front end for things like Tiddly Space, the implications of some of these paramifiers, are unclear and slightly feel like they're stomping on its space because clearly things like this are reasonable to do with server URLs. Having some kind of way of stipulating in a server URL that you want a different thing is fair enough because the server's got an opportunity to validate all that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that was the end of my list. So, pretty short list of things that have been added in the last couple of weeks for 5.0.11. And the plan now is to release 5.0.11 really quite soon. And it's got to that stage where whenever I have to go back and look at 5.0.10, I'm struck by how many differences there are. This button being different, being just one of them. So I think we're in reasonably good shape. When looking at the change list now, it's turned into another reasonably fat release. We are going to be less than a month since the previous release, so that's a speed up. But and I'm one other thing to show you is this list, which we made on a Hangout a few weeks ago originally, and it was originally the wish list for 5.0.10. Then 5.0.10 was rushed out as a sort of rush release after 5.0.9 to fix some problems. Anyway, but we identified the kind of standout things, and now they're done apart from global macros and the plugin library. So both of those now are going to wait till 5.0.12, but that's okay because there's plenty of other big meaty things like the permalinks for people to get their teeth into, and we'll come back to those things.
I'm very excited that we have proper external links now. That's awesome.
Yes, it'll be really interesting to see how readily people get to grips with using them. But yeah, I mean, to me, I had a long discussion with Mario about this. Something that feels very easy to me is being able to do that, where I've just copied the first bit of the URL up to the colon. But he was, I think, rightly expressing concerns that all of that is quite a high degree of dexterity. Anyway, so we're getting closer and closer to a full release. If we zipping back to the roadmap, that's one other thing I'm doing for 5.0.11 is making TiddlyFox do backups with TiddlyWiki 5, which it currently doesn't do. But you may have seen somebody on the group who disastrously thought they'd lost a bunch of data. I believe got most of it back, but that did just act as a prod that I should get that going. But then really we're down to a pretty small number of things. We went through this extensively last week, so I won't go through it line by line. But definitely getting there. So let me unscreen share. In terms of what we do, what we talk about next, kind of in your hands. I mean, we've ended up with a group that's we all got an interest in the developer perspective. So it may be a good opportunity to go into some deeper developer discussions. Equally, as ever, I'm interested in what we can, the opposite end of the scale, what we can do to promote and advance TiddlyWiki. Actually, let me show you one little thing that I was quite pleased with that happened on Friday. This is a Swiss newspaper So I believe it's a regional newspaper, but it may be a national newspaper, and it seems to have at least general national news in it. And on Friday, they published this little article about TiddlyWiki. I noticed it on Twitter. Let me open it in Chrome so that we get the hilarity of a translation. And saw a definite uptick in traffic to tiddlywiki.com. But there's quite a few things that I was very pleased about with this. It's nicely illustrated. I like that he's chosen to illustrate it with a mobile view first, because for people who remember TiddlyWiki from a few years ago, one of the quite significant things that's changed is that now we've got a really good mobile story, and so I'm happy that he chose to lead with that picture. And yeah, anyway, kind of reasonable set of screenshots, and goodness knows what that is, adverts, I think. The Google Translate is hilarious. Behind the TiddlyWikis to hide large ambitions, and hilariousness like referring to a tiddler as a tot, which I really like. And the word Kleinstwiki. But the thing that's cool about it is that the author has picked out very much the features that I would want the mainstream press, if they were to cover TiddlyWiki, to kind of be interested in. And I think what he's saying here is that it's not all, you don't need to be connected to the internet. He's raising the thing about
it's not Dropbox.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that you can do it via Dropbox, but so I think the things that are cool is he's perceived it as a news story. I mean, not exactly a news story, but a newsworthy item, and I think we need that if TiddlyWiki is to achieve more of this kind of coverage. It's also cool that he seems aware of the history. It's nice that he refers to TiddlyWiki's old age, venerability. But I don't know, we shouldn't read too much into it, but it just makes me feel more confident that for a tech journalist coming across TiddlyWiki, that there is a story, that it's possible for them to figure out a story around it without needing to talk to me or anything. Obviously, I believe that it's a story that's relevant for lots of people. There's lots of people reading this and The Guardian and so on every day who would benefit from TiddlyWiki. So it's a good start. And if a journalist on a newspaper in Switzerland can get himself to the point where he's writing this article, then it strikes me that a journalist on a newspaper anywhere in the world could do it next. And it kind of increases my confidence that the focus for me should continue to be on building a great product and not on worrying about journalists. Because as I said, I think it basically will happen if we build a decent, high quality product.
And I think an article like that is evidence that it is or is becoming a decent high-quality product. The fact that the value proposition and it was immediately evident to that person is quite reassuring.
Yeah, no, it's exactly what I'm reading, yeah. We've actually had, in TiddlyWiki.com traffic, every month or so we've had a spike. So about a month ago there was a spike when there was a mention on Slashdot, not on the front page, but in ask.slashdot, some kind of discussion-y bit of Slashdot. And then the month before that, it was a Russian blog, and again, it was only mentioned in the comments of a blog post. But each of those drove a statistically massively significant spike in traffic. And I think what I'm hoping, what I'm saying, what I'm feeling confident about based on that news story is that we can that we can hope for more of those and for them to become closer together. My observation about the mainstream press is that the way things get into newspapers is largely by being in other newspapers. You know, they copy each other terribly. So I feel as though once we break through to a certain level of coverage, that will very quickly, you know, expand to whatever level of coverage something like TiddlyWiki actually deserves in today's media. So, let's just think about the next stage then. Oh, I'm still screen sharing, I'll tell you this. Well, Nathen, is there anything that would be useful or fun for you in terms of dev discussions or anything?
Well, I've kind of been looking at the require mechanism and that, and kind of scratching my head, trying to think of something that's both better and more general than the recent patch that was made. I've also kind of been looking at the server stack, particularly in the context of these startup modules. I kind of started playing around with what an API for a route module or a middleware module kind of might look like. I don't have anything that I would really call pull request worthy yet, but I have some ideas that I'd like to explore there, and really I'd like to explore sort of the overlap of the two. My goal is to sort of get to something like Browserify for TiddlyWiki, something like Browserify CDN, where a client wiki instance could go to its server and say, hey, give me this npm module, and have it in its context. So that's sort of the goal there. But both of those things sort of need to be shored up a bit first. So.
And you're also touching on there's I think a ticket for refactoring server.js so that each route and method is a separate module. And that was
sort of how I'm picturing that. Yeah, I'm sort of picturing that being broken down into sort of two parts. The first would sort of be a mechanism of modules for middleware, and for a stack of middleware. And that stack of middleware would sort of always end in a middleware that is the TiddlyWiki route handler. And then that route handler, in turn, I think would have a set of modules for its routes.
Okay, so you're talking about then those modules would be strung together reusing the same mechanism we use for the startup modules, but they would be it would be a separate what's the word? The graph of modules.
Well, it would actually be two separate graphs. First, a graph of server middleware modules that would basically do things of various sorts with the request and response objects. And then a particular instance of one of those that would then have its own graph specifically for route modules that don't really care about the middleware in front of them. They just want to put a handler on a URL.
Yeah. Got you. Okay.
Does that seem reasonable?
It does indeed. And I think there's some very interesting stuff down there. Things like the degree to which we expose the route handling as tiddlers. So it would be awesome if wiki authors could essentially construct nice friendly URLs using something looking a lot like wiki text format.
Right. That's that was sort of one of the goals of that in terms of the user story. Yeah. For a user to be able to sort of create a tiddler and add a route to their server, whether that be a programmatic route with some JavaScript or some configured route.
So one of the things we will need to address at some point is the fact that if we had that facility on a server that was configured, I don't know, like a normal wiki where people have write access, then anybody with the ability to write a tiddler could perhaps write a bit of configuration that added a dangerous route to expose the password table or something. So I've thought a bit about that as a kind of a couple of ways that we might do that. One simple one, obviously, is making it so that users can't overwrite a system tiddler. And that's a kind of quite a nice middle of the road restriction. Doesn't stop them adding modules, but stops them messing around with things that are already there. And the other thing I've been wondering about is related to supporting multiple wikis at once. So it'd be nice if the server could kick off multiple wikis and listen on different ports, or indeed different routes for those different wikis. And at the moment, that's completely impossible because we've only got a single wiki object, and that wiki object is actually defining the configuration of the server. So I think where we need to go for that is to have these server modules managing a separate wiki object for each wiki that's mounted, so to speak, and that those wiki objects would be separate from the main $tw.wiki object that's being used.
Yeah, and again, some of that kind of touches on the question of code sandboxing and the like. So,
well, great.
I think
the.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say sort of winding back up to the top of where you started with this part of the discussion. The thing that's quite cool is you're doing this refactoring. I assume you're also giving consideration to the kind of standard Node.js interfaces for
Yes.
exposing routes, which, as I understand it, is Express.js and its progeny. So that's, again, very cool. Like the common JS stuff helps to just keep us welded to the mainstream community where we can be, which is cool. But I also appreciate that you're thinking about these security implications, because that's actually the hard thing here, how we balance a single user wiki where the guy sitting in front of it is in total control against a single user wiki that was built for you by somebody else and they want to control it for you. And these multi-user environments where at the flick of a tiddler, you can reconfigure things disastrously.
Right, I think it's ultimately going to come down to having some sort of good basic policy by default. Like you said, don't write system tiddlers.
Yeah.
And then allowing for mechanisms for pluggable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, cool. Anything else, guys? Because I don't know what we should do. Particularly, I guess, Nathan, is there anything else on your agenda?
No, those were. I'm very excited about external links. I'm not sure if I can stress enough.
Yeah, well, things like that have been a long time coming, haven't they?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, well, let me unscreen share, and we'll close things, which gives me a little bit more time than I'm used to having on a Tuesday. There's not going to be a Hangout next week because I'm away, but the following week, 2 weeks' time, so whatever that is, the 27th will be the next one. And hopefully by then, definitely by then, we'll be talking about 5.012, yippee, and plugin repos and stuff like that. Okay, so let's say goodbye, and I'll stop the broadcast, and then I'll stay on the line for a few minutes. Okay, thanks very much for joining me, guys, and thanks very much for an interesting session today. Cheers.